saxophone etudes, so I'll say a little bit about the etudes and play them, and we should have plenty of time for questions. For those of you who worked on the etudes last year, you'll recognize the method book. It's called Selected Studies, and I've scanned the cover so you can see what to look for if you're hunting it down in the music store. The first etude is on page 10. It's the slow G major etude. You'll notice right away one of the distinguishing features of this etude is that it has a lot of trills in there. And I think on most instruments, when we start to see trills, a yellow flag goes off because trills can be problematic. And so before I play the etude, I'll make just one comment about trills. And I know this is something that many of you know, but I think it can be useful to say these things anyway. When you are working on a piece of music like this that has a lot of ornamentation, it's very, very important to remove the ornamentation, especially when you have younger students working on music with ornamentation. Take all of the ornamentation out and let your students play the melody and make sense of it, kind of absorb it and get a feel for what the style is, and then go back later and start to add in the ornamentation. So I'll play a little bit of the opening melody without ornamentation so you can get an idea. So I've taken out the trills and the grace notes. I know that in my own case, I always find that when I remove the ornamentation, it gives me, it makes it easier to kind of get a feel for what the character of the melody is. There's something about trills that are very labor intensive. They tend to kind of use up a lot of our brain power. So for me, it really helps me get a sense of what the music is like. And I know especially for younger students, I think this is a very, very important part of it. I mean, you can imagine if you have a student who is working to play this kind of music and maybe struggling to play it without ornamentation, it will certainly not get any better when you add the ornamentation in. So I will go ahead and play this etude now. Okay, any questions about that etude?
You start the trill on the note, didn't you? Trill up?
Correct. I start all the trills in this etude on the note. Any other questions about that etude? This is our etude number 2. And it's in D major, and it's in 3/4. Also an etude with a lot of trills. I know that probably many of you are saxophone players, and possibly all of you may be saxophone teachers. And so I'm going to ask you all a question. What are some common problems of saxophonists? We're thinking of maybe middle school or high school saxophone players. What are some of the common problems that you all encounter with your saxophone players? Would anybody like to volunteer or something like that?
Tugging too hard.
Okay, tonguing. Rick?
Too loud.
Too loud. Okay. Okay, problem in the low register. Okay. Okay. Okay, B flat fingerings. There's a lot of B flat possibilities on saxophone. Okay. Anything else?
Either their tone is very spread or it's very pinched.
Okay. And she went like this. I know what that means. Pardon?
Not loud enough.
All right. Okay.
Tuning problem. Too hard.
Tuning problem. Okay. So yeah, and so I think my experience is very much like your experience, and I would say that it seems to me that one of the most common problems that we have, and I think that it's to a certain extent the cause of a lot of what you guys are talking about. It's biting. It's just using too much pressure. And so there's a very simple and effective solution for this sort of thing. And I know that many of you may be aware of this, but I think it's something that I use all the time. Have your student on alto anyway. Have your student take the mouthpiece off and play just the mouthpiece. How many of you have done this before? Yeah, good. Okay. And there's a couple different schools of thought. Some people will say you should try for a concert B or a concert B flat. It doesn't matter so much exactly what it is you're going for. It's more about the process of doing this and how it's helpful for both the teacher and the student. But I like to work for a concert A, which is F sharp on alto. So have your students do that in lessons, and it's great because it gives both you and the student a really clear idea of how much pressure they're using on the horn. The other thing that I love about that exercise is very simple, and I know you guys have done this, but another thing that I love about this exercise is that it's something that the student can take with them. So they can take this home. They don't have to be in a lesson to do it. You know, I tell a lot of my students, do this every day, you know, because in many cases, if a student is using too much pressure, it's not a problem that will get solved overnight, right? I mean, you can't just say, okay, don't use pressure, and then the problem is solved. So it's a great exercise because the student can take it home and they can do it, and it very sort of clearly reveals how much pressure they're using in their chops. Once a student has a good, stable concert A, you can encourage them to start to play scales on the mouthpiece. You should be able to play about an octave on the mouthpiece. So I'll go ahead and play this etude number 2. Okay, any questions about that last etude before we move on? Any of you have any questions? Etude number 3 is on page 11. It's the fast G major etude. I noticed when I started to work on these selected studies etudes for this clinic that this is a style of music that saxophonists don't spend a lot of time playing. I think that in many ways the selected studies etudes are kind of like Mozart or Haydn, you know, and on the saxophone we don't really play that repertoire. So one of the things I would suggest to you all is encourage your students to listen to recordings. And then the question becomes, well, if we're talking about classical music, what do we listen to? I mean, there aren't really, unfortunately, recordings of the Mozart saxophone concerto or something that you can go listen to. And so, so I'm gonna recommend 2 recordings. One is a clarinet recording, and some of you may know this. I'm sure probably clarinet players know it, but it's the clarinetist named Robert Marcellus playing the Mozart clarinet concerto with the Cleveland Orchestra. And to me, that's a great example of classical wind playing. So check that out and encourage your students to check that out. Another thing that I would suggest is, and this is easy to do because you can do this on YouTube, but go to YouTube and listen to Maurice Andre recordings. There's tons and tons of recordings of the trumpet player Maurice Andre, playing with chamber orchestras and whatnot. He's been playing some of the Baroque and classical trumpet repertoire. And I think he's a spectacular musician, and it's you know, to me it's also very exciting and kind of interesting because you get to watch him play the horn, you know, which is a little bit different than just listening to a recording. And you can actually see him kind of interacting with an instrument, which, you know, for someone who interacts with an instrument is kind of interesting in a strange way. But like I said, there's lots and lots of Maurice Andre recordings available on YouTube. You should definitely check out. I mentioned earlier that saxophonists don't play a lot of classical repertoire, and to me, there are 2 or 3 things to think about, particularly in the case of the second etude, the one I just played, and also this third etude. I think this kind of music really benefits from precision, lightness, and I might even say a kind of elegance. We don't often use the word elegant and saxophone in the same sentence, but I think I find it very difficult to play something in an elegant way. I think it's easier in many cases to play something with intensity, you know. But these etudes are very sort of light, and particularly when you start looking at this third etude, you'll notice that look at the dynamic markings in this etude. You know, you have piano at the beginning, and it really doesn't get much louder than that. So they're asking you to play very light, soft, which is kind of challenging to do. I read, on the subject of playing soft, I read an article one time, and it was an interview with someone who had studied with this great French saxophonist named Marcel Mule. And he was talking about his lessons. And I thought it was kind of interesting, because I've always been a big fan of Marcel Mule, but I never have really heard firsthand accounts of, you know, what he would tell people to do. And I can't remember who it was, but this person said that one of the things that Marcel Mule would tell people is he would say, if you have something that's technical, practice it very soft. And I thought, well, it's not rocket science, but I started doing that, and I started to realize there's something, you know, there's some wisdom in there. I think it's quite often much more difficult to play things in a very sort of light, soft, dynamic level than it is to play them loud. And usually, if you can play things soft, you can play them loud. So I'll play a little bit of our third etude.